Heaven, How I Got Here, The Story of the Thief on the Cross by Colin Smith. Chapter 7, Agony, 2:59 p.m. Trusting Jesus is never a passport to a pain-free life. That's not his promise. Heaven is. Forgiveness is. The strength to bear up under all that you suffer is what he promises and what he gives. Some folk have the idea that if you trust in Jesus, he will take the pain out of your life. He certainly didn't do that for me. Pain shot through the nerves of my body as much after I trusted Jesus as it did before. With every hour that passed, my pain increased as the wounds from the nails in my hands and my feet widened under the weight of my body. Fever raged. Dehydration followed. My whole body was burning up. It was the same for Jesus, and that is why he cried out, "I thirst." Despite their barbarity, the Roman soldiers sometimes offered a mild sedative to their victims before crucifixion. Early in the morning, they had done this for Jesus, offering him wine mixed with gall, but Jesus refused the sedative. Any compassionate person would say to him, "Drink, take the sedative, dull your senses to the horrors you're about to endure." But he didn't take it. Why? At the time, I despised him for this and counted him a fool. But when I asked him to remember me, I was so glad that his senses were not dulled, drugged, or drowsy. Christ was fully conscious, and that meant that he was ready and able to save me, to pray for his enemies, and to reach out in love to his mother. Becoming a man meant that Jesus' body had a central nervous system just like yours and mine. So the physical agony of crucifixion was the same for Jesus as it was for me. But there was more to his pain than the physical agony. What Jesus endured went far beyond what I experienced that day. Everyone who has ever loved knows that the pain of a separation is always in proportion to the depth of a relationship. If the relationship is casual and short-lived, parting is not so hard. But if a relationship is long-standing, deep, rich, and intimate, the pain of parting will be intense. Think about the relationship Jesus had with his Father. Before the world began, God the Father shared a loving relationship with God the Son. Jesus was one with the Father, always sharing his life and always fully engaged in all that the Father was doing. Jesus continued to enjoy the Father's love throughout the years of his life on earth. When Jesus was baptized, the Father spoke from heaven, "This is my Son, whom I love." And on one occasion, Jesus said about his approaching death, "The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life." Even when he was nailed to the cross, Jesus was conscious of fellowship with his Father and prayed to the Father on behalf of his enemies, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." But when Christ became our sin bearer, he was alone in the darkness. The guilt and stench of our sin was on him as he bore the judgment that we deserved. Jesus had always enjoyed the love of his Father, but now that blessing had been taken away. He couldn't feel the Father's approval. He couldn't reach his comfort. At his hour of greatest need, Jesus was alone, separated from his Father, rejected by his own people, abandoned by his disciples. He was stretched out on a pole, suspended between heaven and earth, and rejected by both. From the deepest darkness, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Nothing that I endured came close to what it meant for him to be forsaken by his Father. And there's more. Jesus experienced hell on the cross. Some people think hell is a myth, but I tell you that hell is as real as the cross. And it's more than just a way of describing something really bad, much more. Hell has 6 dimensions, and Jesus experienced all of them on the cross. He was in conscious suffering. He was in blackest darkness. He was surrounded by demonic powers. He was bearing sin. He was under judgment. He was separated from the knowledge of the love of God. That is hell. I endured the pains of crucifixion, but I did not experience the agonies of hell. Jesus endured them for me so that I would never know what they are like. The more I think about this, the more staggering it gets. If you trust in Jesus as I did, your faith will be tested. You will experience pain, and when you face suffering, you'll find yourself asking why. At some point in your life, you may face an experience that will push you to the outer edge of your endurance. When that happens, you need to know that Jesus has been there too, and he will walk there with you. Is your body racked with pain? Jesus has been there. His bones were pulled out of joint. Are you suffering injustice? Jesus has been there. False witnesses spoke against him. He was condemned without ever committing a crime. Have you ever been abused? Jesus has been there. He suffered verbal abuse in the taunting, jeering, and mocking of the crowd, and he knew physical abuse in the flogging and beating he endured at the hands of the soldiers. Have you been abandoned, deserted, or betrayed? Jesus has been there. One of his inner circle of friends betrayed him, another denied him, and most of the rest fled when he was arrested. If it feels like the light has gone out in your life, Jesus has been there too. He plumbed the depths of darkness as he hung on the cross. When suffering comes into your life, you may find yourself doubting God's love. But don't measure God's love by what is happening to you. Measure it by what happened to Jesus. What must it have cost for the Father to give up his dearly loved Son to the hell on the cross? Try to take that in. What must it have meant for the Holy Son of God to become the sin bearer of the world and be shut out from the Father's love? All of this happened for you. Christ bore sins for you. He endured hell for you, and the depth of his suffering is the measure of his love for you. Now that I'm in heaven, I know that even in the deepest darkness, God the Father never stopped loving his Son. Jesus said, "The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life." If the Father loved the Son for laying down his life, he could have not stopped loving him while he was in the act of doing so. The Father has always loved the Son and always will. But in the darkness, the Son could no longer feel the Father's love. There may come a time in your life when the darkness you face is so great that you can no longer feel the Father's love. But in the darkness, Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He could not feel the Father's love, but even in that awful darkness, God was still his God. Faith does not rest on your ability to feel God's love. It rests on his ability to keep his promise. I learned this within a few hours of becoming a believer. Surrounded by darkness, all I had was Jesus' promise, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Heaven could hardly have felt further away as I writhed in agony a few feet from Jesus. But in my darkest hour, he was with me and he delivered on all that he had promised. When you face the unanswerable why, Jesus can say to you, I've been there too, and even in the darkness, I am still your God. Seeing what Jesus suffered and hearing him cry out in agony had a profound effect on me. From childhood, I'd been told that God's law was given to show us our sin. That's true. But I have to tell you that the clearest view I ever got to the ugliness of my sins was not in reading the 10 Commandments, but in being near to Jesus in that awful darkness on the cross. I began to see that if my sins caused him so much suffering, they must be very great indeed. I learned to hate my sins at the cross. The rebellion that once tasted sweet, the covetous heart that once drove me forward, my hatred and unbelief toward God, and my self-willed desire all seemed ugly and repulsive to me as I saw what they had done to Jesus. His cry of anguish tore me apart. If he was given up for my sins, what sin would I not give up for him? That took hold of me. My greatest desire was to be done with any and every sin that had ever gained a foothold in my life. I found myself longing to be holy, to be filled with the love that I had seen in Jesus' eyes, and to live a life that would please him. I only had a few hours left for that. I hope you have much longer.